In this lesson, we'll explore how we can utilize the contour shader factor color. So with this factor color contour shader, what we'll be able to do is actually create contour lines that are basing their color on the underlying material of our object. Now before we actually set up this factor color contour shader, what we first need to do is take a look inside the render settings. We need to make sure that we already have contour rendering enabled and that we already have the contrast levels function and the contrast store function both plugged in to the custom shaders. Alright, so once we have that done, now we can plug in the factor color. So let's take a look over in the hypershade. This will be found over in the mental ray nodes. This will be found down with the other contour shaders. And right here in the middle we have factor color. Alright, so we'll drop this in, and now we'll make sure that this is connected to our other shaders. So let's take our other materials, take a look at the input connection so we can go to the shading group. We'll expand the mental ray tab and take a look inside contour shader. Middle click, drag this over. Right, so we'll do the same thing with all the other shaders so that way they're all feeding off of this one contour shading node. There we go. And make sure we get this one as well. Alright, excellent. So now let's take a look at what we have. So let's go to our perspective view and render this out. And once this renders out, you'll see that we do now have some contour lines that have been generated around our image. And you can see right now they really don't look like anything in particular. They're just sort of a bunch of colored blobs, really. Now one thing I should mention is that when it comes to the actual rendering of this, one thing that I have also done in this scene is to take a look at the actual contrast function node. So that is right over here, so the contrast function. And I've gone ahead and actually unchecked the difference index, which will make sure that we don't get any sort of contour lines around every triangulated polygon. So, and I've also gone ahead and decreased, or rather increased, the normal difference that is required to actually create some kind of a contour line, so that way we get fewer of these smaller little blobs that appear here and there. So overall though, you can see that we are getting the actual factor color that is happening here. So if we take a look at the actual contour shading node, you really see that we only have a couple of attributes that are responsible for this. One is the overall factor. Now this is basing itself, or really basing its color on the underlying material that we have here. So you can see that these areas around the hair have this sort of a grayish contour line. These areas around the skin have sort of a darker flesh tone, and around the eyes we get sort of a darker blue. So that is controlled by the factor color, the actual darkness. So if we were to increase this to a factor of 1, we save this for comparison, you'll see that once the render completes that the new color is now very, very similar to the original material color. So with a higher factor color, we get these lighter colored lines, or lines that are more closely matched to the actual material color. So this is what we had before. Now likewise, if we were to decrease this factor to something much lower, now the lines should be a much darker derivative of the underlying material. And as you can see, that's exactly the result that we get. So let's also take a look at the actual line width. So let's bump this factor back up to 0.5. The line width is really the overall thickness of these lines. So if we wanted these to be significantly thinner lines, we could lower this to a width of about 0.5. And there we go. Now we have something that's a little bit more controlled. Although you will notice now that whenever we render, we do have these contour lines that have quite a bit of aliasing applied to them. So you can see we really have this very stair-stepped effect on the actual contour line. So what we can do is go back to the render settings, go back to the contours, and we can start to increase this oversampling, which will help soften up those lines. So right now the slider will max out at a value of 3, but we can actually overdrive this by manually typing in a value. So let's start with a value of 3. So that should help to soften out these lines. Save this for comparison, and I'll re-render. And you can see now how that does help pretty significantly. Now we do have one other minor issue, and that is if you take a look at some of these areas, right here is a good illustration of this, where we see the actual contour line that should be behind the eyebrows, actually right in this area does come in front of the eyebrows. And we should have a similar situation back in some of these other areas. I believe there was a few of these other minor clipping issues. Here's another good example where the line that is actually should be going behind the ear does come out in front. Now right now this is a problem that you will run into whenever using this particular contour shader. However, this can be remedied through the use of an output node. So if you want to take a look at how to remedy this particular problem, you can take a look at our lesson that deals with using the contour composite output node. So that's a look at how we can utilize the contour factor color as a way of deriving our actual contour lines based on some kind of an underlying material color.